My name is Gertrude Stein, and I'm 22 years old. 3 years ago, I thought I was applying for my first student loan. Instead, I discovered my family had been systematically destroying my financial future since I was 14. The financial aid office at State University felt suffocating that Tuesday morning in March. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead as I sat across from Mrs. Patterson, a woman whose kind eyes couldn't mask the concern creeping across her face as she stared at her computer screen. "I'm sorry, Gertrude," she said slowly, "but there seems to be some kind of error in your credit report." My stomach dropped. "What kind of error?" She turned the monitor toward me. Numbers swam before my eyes. Negative numbers. Lots of them. "According to this, you have outstanding debts totaling $87,000 across multiple credit cards and payday loans. Some of these accounts were opened when you were," she paused, checking the dates, "when you were 14 years old." The room tilted. I gripped the arms of my chair, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. "That's impossible. I've never had a credit card. I've never taken out any loans." Mrs. Patterson's expression shifted from confusion to something that looked like pity. "Gertrude, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Do you live with family members who might have access to your personal information? Your social security number, birth certificate, things like that?" The question hit me like a physical blow. Images flashed through my mind. My mother asking for my social security card for taxes. My stepfather Dave insisting he needed to hold onto my birth certificate for safekeeping. My older brother Marcus always knowing things about my finances that I'd never told him. "Yes," I whispered. Mrs. Patterson leaned forward. "Gertrude, I think you might be a victim of identity theft. And given your age when some of these accounts were opened, this could be a case of familial financial abuse." The words felt foreign, like she was speaking a different language. Financial abuse. My family wouldn't do that to me. They loved me. They were always talking about how they wanted me to succeed, to be the first in our family to go to college. But as I sat there, staring at the damning evidence on that screen, pieces began falling into place. The way my mother would get defensive when I asked about my social security card, how Dave would change the subject whenever I mentioned wanting to check my credit score, the expensive purchases that appeared in our house, a new TV, a motorcycle for Marcus, designer purses for Mom, right around the times I remembered them asking for my paperwork. "What do?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Mrs. Patterson handed me a tissue I didn't realize I needed. "First, we're going to get you copies of everything. Then, you're going to need to file a police report. This is identity theft, Gertrude. It's a serious crime, even when it's committed by family members." The drive home felt like a death march. I clutched the folder of documents Mrs. Patterson had helped me print, each page a testament to my family's betrayal. Credit card statements showing purchases I'd never made. Payday loan agreements signed with my forged signature. Late payment notices that explained why I'd been getting strange calls from debt collectors. Calls my family had always intercepted, telling me they were just telemarketers. I pulled into our driveway and sat in my car for 10 minutes, staring at the house I'd grown up in. The house that had been purchased, I now realized, with money stolen from my future. When I finally walked inside, I found my mother, Carmen, in the kitchen making dinner. She looked up and smiled, the same warm smile that had comforted me through scraped knees and broken hearts. "Hey, Micha, how did the financial aid meeting go?" I set the folder on the kitchen counter. "We need to talk." Something in my tone made her freeze. "What's wrong?" "I know what you did, what you all did." The color drained from her face. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then, slowly, she set down the wooden spoon she'd been stirring with. "Gertrude, I can explain. $87,000, Mom, since I was 14. Her shoulders sagged. "We were going to pay it back." "When? How? You've been doing this for years." Dave appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound of raised voices. When he saw the folder on the counter and the look on my mother's face, his expression hardened. "You went digging around in things that don't concern you," he said. "Don't concern me?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "It's my name on these credit cards, my social security number, my credit that's destroyed. Marcus wandered in next, earbuds around his neck, looking annoyed at the interruption. When he saw the tense scene, he stopped. "What's going on?" "Gertrude found out about the credit cards," Mom said quietly. Marcus's reaction told me everything I needed to know. No surprise, no confusion, just resignation. "You knew," I said, staring at my brother. "You all knew." "Look, Gertrude." Dave stepped forward. "We did what we had to do. This family was struggling. We needed help." "So you stole from me, from a child." "We borrowed," Mom corrected. "We were always planning to pay it back once things got better." "Things got better for you," I shot back. "You got a new car, a new TV, a motorcycle for Marcus. You got better. My credit got destroyed." Dave's jaw tightened. "You're being dramatic. You're young. You'll bounce back. Credit can be rebuilt. It's not. Do you know what this means?" I pulled out the financial aid denial letter. "I can't get student loans. I can't get an apartment. I can't even get a cell phone plan. You stole my future." "We gave you a future," Mom said, tears starting to flow. "We kept a roof over your head, food on the table. We sacrificed for you. You sacrificed me for you." The argument that followed was unlike anything our family had ever experienced. Voices raised, accusations flew, and through it all, the truth became crystal clear. They felt justified. In their minds, they had been entitled to use my identity, my credit, my future as collateral for their immediate needs. When I told them I was going to file a police report, the room went silent. "You can't do that," Mom whispered. "I can, and I will." "Gertrude, please," she reached for my hand. "We're family. We work things out as a family." I pulled away. Family doesn't steal from each other. Family doesn't destroy each other's lives. Dave's face turned red. "You ungrateful little—" "Dave, stop," Mom interrupted. "No, Carmen. She needs to understand. Everything we did for this family. And now she wants to destroy us? Send us to jail?" "You destroyed yourselves," I said quietly. "You did this." That night, I called my Aunt Rosa, my mother's sister who lived across town. I'd always been close to her, but we'd grown apart over the years. Now I wondered if my family had been isolating me, keeping me from people who might have asked questions. "Tia Rosa, it's Gertrude. I need help." Within an hour, she was at our house. The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult of my life. Rosa listened as I explained everything, her face growing darker with each revelation. "Carmen," she said finally, "how could you do this to your own daughter?" "You don't understand," Mom replied. "We were desperate. We had no choice." "There are always choices. You chose to steal from Gertrude instead of asking for help. You chose to sacrifice her future for your present." Rosa turned to me. "Gertrude, you can stay with me while you figure this out. But you need to know, if you go to the police, there's no taking it back. This will change everything." I looked around the room at the faces of my family. My mother, crying and pleading. Dave, angry and defensive. Marcus, uncomfortable but still silent. These people had shaped my entire life. And now I was discovering it had all been built on a lie. "I know," I said, "but doing nothing changes nothing, and I refuse to let them destroy anyone else." The next morning, I filed the police report. Detective Sarah Martinez was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. She listened to my story without interruption, taking notes as I walked her through the timeline of abuse. "This is more common than you might think," she said when I finished. "Familial identity theft is actually on the rise. Parents, siblings, other relatives, they have easy access to the information they need, and victims often don't discover the theft until they're adults. What happens now? We investigate. We'll need to interview your family members, gather evidence, and build a case. I need to warn you, Gertrude, this process is going to be difficult. Your family will likely pressure you to drop the charges. They might make promises they can't keep, or they might try to make you feel guilty for pursuing justice." She was right. The calls started that afternoon. First Mom, then Dave, then Marcus. Each with their own version of the same message. Family sticks together. This was all a misunderstanding. Couldn't we work it out privately? But I had made my decision. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for every other young person who might be sitting in their family's crosshairs, unaware that their future was being stolen from them, one credit card application at a time. As I sat in Rosa's spare bedroom that night, surrounded by the evidence of my family's betrayal, I made a promise to myself. I would not just survive this. I would not just rebuild my credit and move on with my life. I would make sure this never happened to anyone else. The investigation moved faster than I expected. Within 2 weeks, Detective Martinez had uncovered a web of financial fraud that went deeper than even I had imagined. "Gertrude, I need you to sit down," Detective Martinez said during our third meeting. "We've found additional accounts." My heart sank. "How many?" 17 credit cards, 6 payday loans, and 3 personal loans. The total debt is now at $134,000. The number hit me like a truck. I couldn't breathe. How is that possible? It appears this has been going on for longer than we initially thought. Some of these accounts were opened when you were 12 years old. 12. I was 12 when my family began systematically destroying my financial future. I thought back to that age, 7th grade, braces, still believing in the fundamental goodness of the people who were supposed to protect me. "There's more," Detective Martinez continued. "We found evidence that your identity was used to open utility accounts, a cell phone plan, and even to co-sign on a car loan." The car loan. I remembered now. When I was 16, Dave had gotten a great deal on a used truck. He'd been so proud, telling everyone how he'd managed to get approved despite his past credit issues. I'd been happy for him. I'd been happy that they were using my identity to steal from me. "Gertrude, I need to ask you something difficult. Did your family ever suggest that you were responsible for helping with their financial problems? Did they ever make you feel like you owed them something?" The question unlocked a flood of memories. The constant reminders of how much they'd sacrificed for me. The way they'd make me feel guilty for wanting things they claimed they couldn't afford, while somehow always finding money for their own wants. The subtle and not so subtle implications that I was a burden, that I needed to contribute to the family. "Yes," I whispered. "All the time." That's part of the psychological manipulation that often accompanies financial abuse, Detective Martinez explained. They condition the victim to feel responsible for the family's financial problems, which makes it easier to justify the theft. The next few weeks were a blur of interviews, document reviews, and legal proceedings. I learned about the complex world of identity theft investigation, the painstaking process of proving that I hadn't authorized these accounts, and the legal distinction between identity theft and authorized user fraud. My family's response evolved as the investigation progressed. First came denial. They claimed I had known about and authorized the accounts. When that didn't work, they moved to minimization, insisting that the amounts were smaller than claimed, that they had made payments on some accounts, that I was exaggerating the impact. Finally, they settled on emotional manipulation. "Gertrude, please," Mom sobbed during one of our court-mandated family meetings. "You're going to destroy this family. Is that what you want? Do you want to be responsible for breaking us apart?" "I didn't break this family apart," I replied. "You did that when you decided to steal from me." Dave was less subtle. "You think you're so smart, don't you? You think you can just destroy the people who raised you and walk away? This is going to backfire on you, Gertrude. You're going to end up with nothing, and it'll be your own fault." The threats were harder to deal with than the tears. Rosa had to change her locks after we discovered Dave had been driving by her house at night. My phone buzzed constantly with calls from numbers I didn't recognize. Family friends, distant relatives, even some of my old high school classmates, all calling to tell me I was making a mistake. "They're mobilizing their flying monkeys," my therapist, Dr. Kim, explained during one of our sessions. Rosa had insisted I start therapy to help me process the trauma and manipulation I'd experienced. Flying monkeys? It's a term from psychology. When an abuser can't directly access their victim, they recruit others to do their emotional work for them. They tell these people a version of the story that makes them look like the victim, and then those people reach out to pressure the real victim to forgive or understand or think of the family. So all these people calling me are being manipulated just like you were. The difference is, they don't have all the facts. They've been told a story designed to make you look like the bad guy. Dr. Kim helped me understand that what I'd experienced wasn't just financial abuse. It was part of a larger pattern of emotional and psychological manipulation that had been happening my entire life. The financial theft was just the most tangible, provable aspect of a much deeper problem. Abusers don't just steal money, she explained. They steal your sense of reality, your ability to trust your own judgment, your belief that you deserve better. The financial abuse is devastating, but the psychological damage can be even worse. As the legal case progressed, I began to see the broader scope of my family's dysfunction. The financial records told a story of impulsive decisions, poor planning, and a complete disregard for the consequences of their actions. But more than that, they revealed a pattern of entitlement and exploitation that went far beyond money. 3 months into the investigation, Detective Martinez called with news that changed everything. "Gertrude, we've discovered that you're not the only victim." "What do you mean?" "We found evidence that your family has been using other people's identities as well. Your grandmother's, your cousin Maria's, even your late grandfather's social security number has been used fraudulently." The scope of the fraud was staggering. My family had been running what amounted to a small-scale identity theft ring, using the personal information of anyone they could access to fund their lifestyle. I thought about my cousin Maria, who was only 19 and had mentioned having trouble getting approved for a car loan. I thought about my grandmother, who lived on a fixed income and had been struggling financially for years. "How many people?" I asked. "At least 7 that we've found so far. The total fraud amount is approaching $300,000. I felt sick. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about everyone in my extended family who had trusted these people with their personal information. Everyone who had been victimized by the people who were supposed to protect them. That night, I called Maria. "Gertrude, I haven't heard from you in months. Your mom said you were going through some kind of phase. Maria, I need to ask you something. Have you ever had trouble with your credit? Problems getting approved for loans or credit cards?" There was a long pause. "Actually, yes. How did you know?" "I think we need to talk." The conversation that followed was one of the hardest of my life. I had to tell my cousin that her beloved Tia Carmen and Uncle Dave had been stealing from her, just like they'd been stealing from me. I had to watch her go through the same stages of disbelief, anger, and heartbreak that I'd experienced. But I also got to watch her find her strength. "What do we do?" she asked when I finished explaining everything. "We fight back," I said. "We make sure this never happens to anyone else." By the end of that week, 3 more family members had joined our growing group of victims. Each had their own story of financial problems they couldn't explain, of credit issues that seemed to come out of nowhere, of trusting family members who had betrayed that trust in the most fundamental way. We began meeting regularly, sharing information and supporting each other through the legal process. What started as individual cases of identity theft had become something much larger, a reckoning with a family culture that had normalized theft, manipulation, and exploitation. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in October. As I sat in the courthouse waiting room, surrounded by my fellow victims and our legal team, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not hope that things would go back to the way they were, that ship had sailed. But hope that we could build something better. Hope that we could break the cycle of abuse that had been passed down through generations of our family. Hope that we could create a future where young people didn't have to discover at 18 that their families had been stealing their dreams. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Walsh, was a woman in her 30s who specialized in financial crimes. She'd been working on our case for months, and I could see in her eyes the same anger and determination that I felt. "Gertrude, I want you to know that what you've done, coming forward, bringing this to light, it's incredibly brave. Most people in your situation never report familial identity theft. They're too scared, too ashamed, or too manipulated to seek justice." "I couldn't let them keep doing this to other people," I replied. "That's exactly why we're going to win this case. Your family is going to face consequences for what they've done. But more importantly, you and the other victims are going to get your lives back." As we walked into the courtroom, I saw my mother, Dave, and Marcus sitting at the defendant's table with their lawyer. Mom looked older than I remembered, her face drawn and tired. Dave looked angry, his jaw clenched as he stared straight ahead. Marcus just looked lost. For a moment, I felt a pang of sadness for what we'd all lost. But then I remembered the credit reports, the forged signatures, the years of manipulation and lies. I remembered the other victims sitting behind me, people whose lives had been damaged by the same people who were now playing the role of the injured party. I remembered the choice I'd made months ago in that financial aid office. I would not just survive this. I would make sure it never happened to anyone else. The hearing began, and I prepared to tell my story in full for the first time in a legal setting. As I walked to the witness stand, I felt the weight of not just my own future, but the futures of everyone who had been victimized by the people who were supposed to love and protect us. It was time to reclaim what had been stolen from us. It was time to build something new. The trial lasted 3 weeks. 3 weeks of testimony, evidence, and the painful process of laying bare the full scope of my family's betrayal in front of a room full of strangers. I was the first witness called. As I sat in the witness stand, looking out at the faces in the courtroom, I felt the full weight of what I was about to do. This wasn't just about seeking justice for myself. It was about speaking for everyone who had been victimized by people they trusted. ADA Walsh began with the basics: my name, my age, my relationship to the defendants. Then she moved into the heart of the matter. Gertrude, when did you first discover that your identity had been stolen? I took a deep breath and began to tell my story. I spoke about that day in the financial aid office, about the shock of discovering I was $87,000 in debt. I described the crushing realization that my own family had been systematically destroying my financial future since I was 12 years old. The defense attorney, a middle-aged man named Robert Chen, tried to paint me as a vindictive daughter who was blowing a family misunderstanding out of proportion. He suggested that I had known about the credit cards and had benefited from the lifestyle they provided. Miss Stein, isn't it true that you lived in a nice house growing up? That you had food on the table, clothes to wear, a roof over your head? Yes, and isn't it true that your parents sacrificed to provide those things for you? I felt the familiar guilt rising up, the same manipulation I'd experienced my entire life. But months of therapy had prepared me for this moment. Mr. Chen, my parents didn't sacrifice to provide those things. They stole from me to provide those things. There's a difference between sacrifice and theft. But you benefited from their spending, didn't you? I benefited from having a roof over my head, yes, but I would have preferred a roof over my head that wasn't purchased with money stolen from my future. I would have preferred parents who worked to provide for me rather than parents who stole from me to provide for themselves. The courtroom was silent. I could see the jury listening intently, and I could see my mother crying at the defendant's table. But I also saw Dave's face, still hard with anger and resentment. Even now, even faced with the full weight of the evidence against him, he felt entitled to what he'd stolen from me. Maria testified next, describing how she discovered that her identity had been used to open credit cards and take out loans. Her testimony was particularly powerful because she was able to show bank records proving that the money from these accounts had been used to make payments on the accounts opened in my name, a clear indication that this was an organized scheme rather than isolated incidents. My cousin David, who was 25 and had been planning to buy a house, testified about how he'd been denied a mortgage because of credit damage he couldn't explain. The investigation had revealed that his identity had been used to open several store credit cards that had been maxed out and never paid. One by one, 7 family members took the stand to describe how they'd been victimized by the same people who were supposed to protect them. The cumulative effect was devastating. This wasn't just about money. It was about the complete betrayal of trust that holds families together. But the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source, my grandmother. Abuela Rosa was 82 years old and had been living on Social Security for the past 15 years. She walked slowly to the witness stand with the help of a cane, and when she spoke, her voice was strong and clear. I gave my daughter my social security number because she said she needed it to help me with my taxes. She testified in Spanish, with a translator providing the English version. I trusted her because she was my daughter. I trusted her because family is supposed to take care of family. The prosecutor showed her the evidence. Her social security number had been used to open 3 credit cards and 2 payday loans, totaling over $15,000 in debt. Mrs. Stein, did you authorize these accounts? No, Abuela Rosa said firmly. I would never take out loans I couldn't pay back. I would never put my family in debt. Did you benefit from any of the money taken out in your name? No. I have been struggling to pay my bills while my daughter was buying new cars and expensive clothes with money stolen from my name. The defense attorney tried to suggest that my grandmother was confused, that she might have forgotten giving permission for these accounts. But Abuela Rosa was sharp as a tack, and her testimony was devastating. Young man, she said, looking directly at Mr. Chen, I may be old, but I am not stupid. I know the difference between helping my family and having my family steal from me. The moment that broke my heart, and I think broke the hearts of everyone in that courtroom, came when the prosecutor asked her how she felt about her daughter's actions. I feel like I failed as a mother, Abuela Rosa said, tears streaming down her face. I feel like I didn't teach her right from wrong. I feel like I raised someone who could steal from her own children, her own mother, her own family. The guilt and pain in her voice was unbearable. Here was a woman who had been victimized by her own daughter, and she was blaming herself for not preventing it. Mrs. Stein, the prosecutor said gently, what your daughter did was not your fault. You trusted her, because that's what families do. The failure is hers, not yours. When it was time for the defense to present their case, they called my mother to the stand. I watched as she walked to the witness stand, looking smaller and more fragile than I'd ever seen her. Her testimony was a masterclass in manipulation and self-pity. She spoke about how difficult it had been to raise children as a single mother, conveniently ignoring the fact that Dave had been in the picture for most of my life. She talked about the sacrifices she'd made, the bills she'd struggled to pay, the pressure she'd felt to provide for her family. I never meant to hurt Gertrude, she said, tears streaming down her face. I love my daughter. I was just trying to take care of my family. But under cross-examination, the truth came out. ADA Walsh methodically walked through the timeline of fraud, showing how the theft had continued and escalated over years. She showed bank records proving that the money stolen from family members had been used for luxury purchases, not necessities. Mrs. Stein, you testified that you were struggling to pay bills, but these records show that you used money from credit cards opened in your daughter's name to purchase a motorcycle for your son. Was that motorcycle a necessity? Marcus needed transportation for work. But he already had a car, didn't he? Yes, but... And you used your mother's social security number to open credit cards that you used to purchase designer handbags. Were those handbags necessities? The questioning went on for hours. With each answer, it became clear that this wasn't about desperation or survival. It was about entitlement and greed. My mother and Dave had felt entitled to use other people's identities to fund their lifestyle, and they had justified it by telling themselves that family members should be willing to sacrifice for each other. Dave's testimony was even worse. He showed no remorse, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing. He maintained that he had been helping the family, that everyone had benefited from his actions, and that the real problem was that ungrateful family members were now turning on each other. These people lived in my house, ate my food, and now they want to send me to prison for doing what I had to do to take care of them, he said. Mr. Rodriguez, you testified that you were taking care of the family. But isn't it true that you used Gertrude's identity to purchase a motorcycle for yourself? The motorcycle was for the family. We all used it. Mr. Rodriguez, Gertrude was 16 years old when you purchased this motorcycle. She didn't even have a license to drive it. She could have learned. The exchanges were so absurd that I might have laughed if the situation weren't so tragic. Here was a man who had stolen thousands of dollars from children and elderly family members, and he was trying to justify it by saying they could have learned to ride a motorcycle. The most damaging testimony came from Marcus. I had hoped that my brother would show some remorse, some acknowledgement of the harm that had been done. Instead, he doubled down on the family's narrative of victimhood. Gertrude was always the favorite, he testified. She was always the one who got everything she wanted. Mom and Dave worked hard to give her opportunities, and now she's trying to destroy the family because she didn't get into college. Mr. Stein, you testified that Gertrude was the favorite, but isn't it true that you received a motorcycle purchased with money stolen from Gertrude's identity? That motorcycle was for the family. Mr. Stein, did you ever ride that motorcycle? Yes. Did Gertrude ever ride that motorcycle? No, but... So you benefited from the fraud committed in your sister's name, and she didn't? Marcus's testimony revealed the depth of the family's dysfunction. He genuinely believed that he had been victimized by my success in school, that I had somehow been taking from him by getting good grades and planning for college. The idea that I had been the one being stolen from was incomprehensible to him. During the rebuttal phase, I was called back to the witness stand. ADA Walsh asked me to respond to my family's claims that I had known about and benefited from the fraud. Gertrude, you've heard testimony from your family members suggesting that you knew about these accounts and that you benefited from them. How do you respond to those claims? I looked out at the courtroom, at the faces of my fellow victims, at the jury who would decide our fate. I thought about all the young people who might be sitting in their families' crosshairs right now, unaware that their futures were being stolen from them. I want to be very clear about something, I said. Even if I had known about these accounts, which I didn't, that wouldn't make them legal. A 12-year-old cannot consent to having their identity stolen. A 14-year-old cannot consent to financial abuse. A 16-year-old cannot consent to having their future destroyed. I paused, gathering my thoughts. But more than that, I want to talk about what benefiting means. Yes, I lived in a house. Yes, I had food and clothing. But I also lived in a family where love was conditional, where I was constantly told that I owed them something, where I was made to feel guilty for wanting a future that didn't involve being their financial victim. The defense wants you to believe that I benefited from this fraud. But here's what I actually got. I got a family that taught me that my worth was measured by what I could provide for them. I got parents who stole from me and then made me feel guilty for existing. I got a future that was stolen before I was old enough to understand what was being taken from me. So no, I didn't benefit from this fraud. I was victimized by it in every way that matters. The closing arguments were emotional and powerful. ADA Walsh systematically laid out the evidence, showing the jury the full scope of the fraud and its impact on the victims. She spoke about the trust that had been violated, the futures that had been stolen, and the need for justice. The defense attorney made one last attempt to paint this as a family dispute that had gotten out of hand. He asked the jury to consider the human cost of convicting the defendants, to think about the families that would be broken apart by a guilty verdict. But ADA Walsh's rebuttal was devastating. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the defense wants you to believe that this case is about breaking up a family. But this family was broken long before these charges were filed. It was broken the moment these defendants decided that they were entitled to steal from children, from elderly family members, from the people who trusted them most. The defense wants you to worry about the human cost of a conviction. But what about the human cost of what these defendants did? What about Gertrude, who can't get student loans because her own mother destroyed her credit? What about Maria, who can't buy a car because her uncle stole her identity? What about an 82-year-old grandmother who has to worry about debt collectors because her daughter used her social security number to fund a lifestyle she couldn't afford? The defendants want you to believe that they are the victims here. But the real victims are the people who trusted them, who loved them, who believed that family meant something more than an opportunity for exploitation. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned with their verdict, I felt like I couldn't breathe. On the charge of identity theft in the first degree, we find the defendant, Carmen Stein, guilty. On the charge of identity theft in the first degree, we find the defendant, David Rodriguez, guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit identity theft, we find the defendant, Marcus Stein, guilty. One by one, the guilty verdicts were read. My mother cried. Dave looked angry. Marcus looked shocked, as if he couldn't believe there were actually consequences for his actions. I felt empty. Not happy, not sad, just empty. This wasn't the ending I had wanted. I had wanted my family to acknowledge what they had done, to apologize, to make amends. Instead, they had fought us every step of the way, maintaining their innocence and their victimhood right up until the moment they were convicted. But as I looked around the courtroom at my fellow victims, I saw something else. Relief. The validation that comes from having your truth acknowledged. The knowledge that they would never be able to do this to anyone else. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following month. As we left the courthouse that day, I realized that while this chapter of my story was ending, the next one was just beginning. I had survived the worst betrayal imaginable. I had found my voice, my strength, and my purpose. And now, it was time to build something new. The sentencing hearing was held on a cold December morning. As I sat in the courtroom, listening to the judge hand down the sentences, 3 years for Mom, 5 years for Dave, 2 years for Marcus, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Justice had been served, but it felt hollow. These people had been my family, and now they were going to prison because of choices they had made. Choices that had hurt not just me, but everyone who had trusted them. The judge allowed victim impact statements, and I had prepared mine carefully. When my turn came, I walked to the podium and looked out at the courtroom one last time. Your Honor, I want to talk about what justice means to me. For a long time, I thought justice meant getting my family to admit what they had done wrong, to apologize, to somehow undo the damage they had caused. But I've learned that justice isn't about getting the people who hurt you to validate your pain. Justice is about making sure they can't hurt anyone else. I looked directly at my mother, who was crying silently at the defendant's table. I loved you, I said to her. I trusted you, and you used that love and trust to steal from me. You stole my money, my credit, my future. But more than that, you stole my ability to trust, my sense of safety, my belief that family meant something sacred. I turned to Dave. You taught me that the people who claim to love you can be the most dangerous people in your life. You taught me that predators don't always look like strangers. Sometimes they look like the people who tuck you in at night. Finally, I looked at Marcus, and you taught me that being a victim of the same system doesn't make you innocent if you choose to perpetuate it rather than break it. I took a deep breath and continued. But here's what I want you to know. You didn't break me. You tried to steal my future, but you couldn't steal my determination to build a better one. You tried to steal my voice, but you couldn't steal my courage to speak up. You tried to steal my ability to trust, but you couldn't steal my ability to love myself enough to demand better. I am not the same person I was when this started. I am stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever to make sure that what happened to me never happens to anyone else. Your actions didn't just create victims, they created advocates, and we will spend the rest of our lives making sure that other families don't have to go through what we went through. The judge thanked me for my statement and moved on to sentencing. As I watched my family members being led away in handcuffs, I felt a chapter of my life closing, but I also felt a new chapter beginning. Over the next few months, I threw myself into rebuilding my life. The legal team helped me navigate the complex process of disputing the fraudulent accounts and repairing my credit. It was slow, frustrating work that required constant vigilance and documentation, but gradually I began to see progress. More importantly, I began to see a purpose. Rosa had been right when she said that pursuing justice would change everything. But the changes weren't just about my family. They were about me. I had discovered a strength I never knew I possessed, a voice I never knew I had, and a calling I never knew existed. I started by volunteering with a local nonprofit that helped victims of financial abuse. The work was emotionally challenging, but deeply rewarding. I met people who had experienced similar betrayals, adult children whose parents had destroyed their credit, elderly people whose relatives had stolen their life savings, young people who had discovered that their loving families had been systematically exploiting them. Each story was different, but the patterns were always the same: the exploitation of trust, the manipulation and gaslighting, the way perpetrators convinced their victims that they were somehow responsible for their own abuse, the way families and communities often sided with the abusers, pressuring victims to forgive and forget rather than seek justice. After 6 months of volunteer work, I was offered a full-time position as a victim advocate. The salary wasn't much, but it was enough to live on. And more importantly, it gave me a platform to help other people navigate the same system I had struggled through. But I knew I wanted to do more than just help people after they had been victimized. I wanted to prevent the victimization from happening in the first place. That's when I decided to start the podcast. Stolen Futures launched on a Tuesday morning in March, exactly 1 year after I had discovered the extent of my family's fraud. The first episode was my story, told in my own words, with all the details I had learned to share without shame or apology. The response was overwhelming. Within a week, I had received hundreds of messages from people who had experienced similar abuse. Some were just discovering the fraud for the first time. Others had known about it for years, but had never reported it. Still others had reported it, but had been pressured by their families to drop the charges. Each message reinforced my belief that this was a much bigger problem than most people realized. Familial financial abuse was happening in families across the country, across all socioeconomic levels, and victims were suffering in silence because they were too ashamed to speak up or too manipulated to recognize the abuse for what it was. I decided to dedicate each episode to a different aspect of financial abuse. I interviewed experts on identity theft, psychologists who specialized in family trauma, lawyers who worked on financial crimes, and most importantly, survivors who were willing to share their stories. The episode that changed everything was number 7, The Reckoning. I had been hesitant to share the full details of the trial and my family's reactions to being held accountable. But I realized that people needed to understand what the process of seeking justice actually looked like, including the ways that abusers and their enablers respond when they are confronted with the consequences of their actions. In that episode, I shared audio recordings of some of the voicemails my family had left me during the investigation. With the help of my legal team, I had gotten permission to share them as part of the public record. The first recording was from my mother, left 3 days after I filed the police report. "Gertrude, Mia, please call me back. I know you're angry, but we can work this out as a family. You don't need to involve strangers in our business. This is going to hurt everyone, not just me and Dave. Think about your abuela. Think about your cousins. Do you really want to be responsible for tearing this family apart?" The second was from Dave, left a week later. "Gertrude, I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but you need to stop this nonsense right now. You're embarrassing yourself and hurting people who love you. If you think you're going to come out of this looking like some kind of hero, you're wrong. Everyone knows what kind of person you really are." The third was from Marcus, left the night before the trial began. "Gertrude, I can't believe you're actually going through with this. Mom is crying every day, and it's your fault. You used to be cool, but now you're just like Dad, selfish and mean. I hope you're happy with yourself." The response to that episode was unlike anything I had experienced. Thousands of people reached out to share their own stories of family manipulation, of being made to feel guilty for seeking justice, of being told that they were responsible for breaking up the family when they tried to hold abusers accountable. But more importantly, people began to recognize the patterns in their own lives. They began to see that the gaslighting, the guilt tripping, and the emotional manipulation they had experienced were not isolated incidents, but part of a larger system of abuse. The podcast grew rapidly. Within 6 months, Stolen Futures was reaching over 100,000 listeners per episode. I was invited to speak at conferences, to write articles for major publications, and to consult with organizations that worked with financial abuse victims. But the moment I knew I was making a real difference came when I received an email from a 17-year-old girl named Sarah. "Gertrude," she wrote, "I listened to your podcast and realized that my mom has been using my social security number to open credit cards. I found the statements hidden in her bedroom. I don't know what to do. I'm scared to confront her because I know she'll say I'm being ungrateful and that I owe her for everything she's done for me. But I also know that if I don't do something now, I'm going to be in the same situation you were in when I try to go to college next year. Can you help me?" I spent 3 hours on the phone with Sarah that evening, walking her through the same process I had gone through. I helped her understand her rights, connected her with resources in her area, and most importantly, helped her understand that she was not responsible for her mother's actions. 2 months later, Sarah sent me another email. "Gertrude, I wanted to let you know that I filed a police report yesterday. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, but I knew it was the right thing. My mom is angry, and she's trying to make me feel guilty, but I remember what you said about how abusers always try to make their victims feel responsible for the consequences of their actions. I'm not responsible for what she did to me, and I'm not responsible for what happens to her now. Thank you for showing me that I deserved better, and that I had the power to demand it." Stories like Sarah's poured in from across the country. Young people who had discovered that their parents were stealing from them. Adult children who had learned that their elderly parents were being financially exploited. Spouses who had found out that their partners were using their identities to hide debt and spending. Each story reinforced my belief that financial abuse was not just a personal problem, but a systemic one. It was happening because we lived in a culture that prioritized family loyalty over individual rights, that taught people to accept abuse in the name of love, and that provided few resources for victims who were brave enough to speak up. I decided to do something about it. Working with a team of lawyers, victim advocates, and technology experts, I launched the Stolen Futures Foundation. Our mission was simple: to prevent financial abuse by educating people about their rights, providing resources for victims, and advocating for stronger legal protections. The Foundation's first project was a comprehensive online resource center that provided step-by-step guides for victims of financial abuse. We created content explaining how to check your credit report, how to dispute fraudulent accounts, how to file police reports, and how to navigate the legal system. But we also created content addressing the psychological aspects of financial abuse. We had resources explaining gaslighting, manipulation, and emotional coercion. We had guides for recognizing the signs of financial abuse in your own relationships. We had support groups for victims who were struggling with the guilt and shame that often accompanied the realization that they had been abused by people they loved. The Foundation's second project was a legislative advocacy campaign. We worked with lawmakers to introduce bills that would strengthen protections for victims of familial identity theft, make it easier to prosecute financial abuse cases, and provide more resources for victims. The work was challenging and often frustrating. Change happened slowly, and there were many times when I felt overwhelmed by the scope of the problem. But every time I received a message from someone who had been helped by our resources, every time I saw a news story about a financial abuse case being prosecuted successfully, every time I met another survivor who had found their voice and their strength, I was reminded of why this work mattered. 3 years after that first day in the financial aid office, I stood in front of a Senate subcommittee to testify in support of the Familial Identity Theft Protection Act. As I looked out at the senators and the audience in the gallery, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. I had started as a victim, a young woman whose family had stolen her future and left her with nothing but debt and betrayal. But I had refused to stay a victim. I had found my voice, my strength, and my purpose. I had transformed my pain into power, my trauma into advocacy. Senators, I began, I am here today to tell you about a crime that is happening in families across America. It is a crime that steals more than money. It steals trust, it steals futures, and it steals the fundamental belief that family is supposed to be a source of love and protection, not exploitation and abuse. I told them about my story, about the other victims I had met, and about the urgent need for stronger legal protections. I spoke about the young people who were being victimized right now, who would discover in a few years that their families had been systematically destroying their financial futures. This is not just about money, I concluded. This is about the basic human right to have a future that is not stolen from you by the people who claim to love you. This is about the right to trust that your family will protect you, not exploit you. This is about ensuring that every young person in America can pursue their dreams without discovering that those dreams have been sold to pay for someone else's lifestyle. The bill passed the subcommittee unanimously. 6 months later, it became federal law. As I stood in the Rose Garden watching the president sign the Familial Identity Theft Protection Act, I felt a sense of completion that I had never experienced before. This was what justice looked like. Not just punishment for the people who had hurt me, but systemic change that would protect future victims. That evening, I recorded a special episode of Stolen Futures to commemorate the moment. As I spoke into the microphone in my small home studio, I thought about all the people who would be helped by this new law, all the young people who would be protected from the kind of abuse I had experienced. 4 years ago, I said, I discovered that my family had been stealing from me since I was 12 years old. I discovered that the people I trusted most had betrayed me in the most fundamental way possible. I discovered that my future had been sold to pay for their present. But I also discovered something else. I discovered that I was stronger than I knew, braver than I believed, and more determined than I had ever imagined. I discovered that being a victim of abuse doesn't mean you have to stay a victim. I discovered that the people who try to steal your future can't steal your power to build a new one. To everyone listening who has been where I was, who has discovered that their family has betrayed them, who feels alone and scared and overwhelmed, I want you to know that you are not alone. You are not responsible for what was done to you, but you are responsible for what you do next. You have the power to seek justice, to rebuild your life, and to make sure that what happened to you never happens to anyone else. Your future was stolen from you, but that doesn't mean you don't have a future. It just means you get to build a new one that belongs entirely to you. As I finished recording that episode, I realized that my story wasn't really about revenge at all. It was about reclamation. It was about taking back what had been stolen from me, not just my money and my credit, but my sense of self, my ability to trust, and my belief in my own worth. My family had tried to steal my future, but they couldn't steal my determination to build a better one. They had tried to steal my voice, but they couldn't steal my courage to speak up. They had tried to steal my ability to trust, but they couldn't steal my capacity to love myself enough to demand better, and to love others enough to fight for their right to demand better too. I had started this journey as Gertrude Stein, the victim of familial financial abuse, but I was ending it as Gertrude Steen, advocate, survivor, and founder of a movement that would protect thousands of other young people from experiencing what I had gone through. The people who had tried to steal my future had actually given me something far more valuable. They had given me a purpose, a calling, and a chance to transform my pain into power. That night, as I prepared for bed in my small apartment, an apartment I had been able to afford because I had rebuilt my credit piece by piece over the course of 4 years, I reflected on everything that had happened since that day in the financial aid office. I had lost a family, but I had gained a community of survivors who understood my experience in ways my biological family never could. I had lost my innocence about the people I trusted, but I had gained wisdom about how to protect myself and others from similar harm. I had lost the future I had planned, but I had built a future that was more meaningful and impactful than anything I could have imagined. My phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah, the 17-year-old who had reached out to me 3 years earlier. Gertrude, I wanted to let you know that I just got accepted to Stanford with a full scholarship. None of this would have been possible if you hadn't helped me understand that I deserved better. Thank you for showing me that being a victim is something that happens to you, but being a survivor is something you choose to become." I smiled as I read her message. This was what victory looked like. Not the destruction of the people who had hurt me, but the empowerment of the people who had been hurt like me. As I turned off the lights and settled into bed, I thought about the young people who were out there right now, unaware that their families might be stealing their futures. I thought about the ones who would discover the theft tomorrow, next week, next year. I thought about the resources that would be available to them because of the work we had done, the laws that would protect them because of the advocacy we had pursued, the community that would support them because of the movement we had built. My family had tried to steal my future, but in the end, they had given me something far more valuable. They had given me the chance to protect other people's futures. They had given me the opportunity to transform my pain into purpose, my trauma into triumph. And in the quiet darkness of my apartment, surrounded by the life I had built from the ashes of the one that had been stolen from me, I realized that this was the greatest revenge of all. Not the destruction of the people who had hurt me, but the construction of a world where fewer people would be hurt the same way. I had survived, I had thrived, and I had made sure that my suffering would not be meaningless. My future had been stolen, but I had built a new one, and it was beautiful.